It started with a suitcase that looked completely ordinary. On a busy afternoon at Miami International Airport, thousands of passengers were moving through the terminal. Families rushed toward departure gates. Business travelers checked their phones. Security officers watched the crowds. Among them was a man who believed he had planned the perfect smuggling operation. For months, he had prepared every detail. He believed airport security would never notice. But within the next few hours, a single mistake would trigger an investigation that would uncover a drug trafficking operation worth millions of dollars. And by the end of the day, federal agents would be waiting for him. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The traveler had a valid passport, a confirmed ticket, no criminal record visible in standard database checks. His behavior appeared calm and controlled. But experienced airport officers know that successful smugglers rarely look nervous. The most dangerous traffickers are often the ones who appear completely normal. Investigators would later learn that this trip had been carefully planned weeks in advance. The suspect had received instructions from members of a drug trafficking network operating across multiple countries. His role was simple: transport the suitcase, deliver it to a contact, collect payment, and disappear. At least that was the plan. According to investigators, the organization had used the same method many times before. The drugs were not hidden in obvious places. There were no secret compartments, no modified luggage, no Hollywood-style tricks. Instead, the smugglers relied on something far more effective: blending in. As the suitcase moved toward the baggage screening system, dozens of bags entered the X-ray machines every minute. Most passed without incident. But this bag was about to attract attention, not because of what officers saw, but because of what they didn't see. An experienced screening officer noticed an unusual density pattern inside the suitcase. The contents appeared strangely uniform, too uniform. Years of training had taught officers that certain concealment methods create subtle irregularities on X-ray images. This pattern matched one of them. The officer requested a secondary inspection. That decision would change everything. Within minutes, additional personnel arrived. The suitcase was quietly removed from the baggage stream. The passenger had no idea his journey was already beginning to unravel. While the passenger waited near the departure gate, officers began a detailed examination. Every zipper, every pocket, every layer of fabric. Nothing was overlooked, because experienced investigators know that traffickers often depend on rushed inspections. At first, the search revealed nothing unusual. Clothes, toiletries, travel items, exactly what officers expected to find. But something still felt wrong. The weight of the suitcase didn't match its contents. And that observation triggered the next phase of the investigation. Then came the moment that changed the case. An officer lifted one section of the suitcase and noticed resistance beneath the interior lining. The material felt thicker than normal. Carefully, investigators began examining the hidden layer. Within minutes, they would discover something worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the passenger sitting at the gate still had no idea. The moment investigators peeled back the inner lining, they found several tightly wrapped rectangular packages hidden inside the suitcase frame. This was no accident. The concealment had been professionally designed, and everyone in the room immediately understood they were dealing with something much bigger than a routine airport inspection. One officer carefully removed the first package and placed it on the examination table. Its weight was unusual. Its wrapping was precise. Years of experience told investigators exactly what they were probably looking at. But assumptions weren't enough. They needed proof. A preliminary narcotics field test was prepared. The room fell silent. Even experienced officers knew these moments mattered. Within minutes, the test produced a reaction consistent with cocaine. The suspicion was now becoming evidence. Additional packages were removed one by one. The count kept rising. 5, 7, 9, then 12. Every discovery increased the estimated value of the shipment. This was no personal use quantity. This was trafficking. At the departure gate, the passenger remained completely unaware. He checked his phone, looked at flight information, and waited to board. Meanwhile, less than 1,000 feet away, federal authorities were already building a criminal case against him. Customs and Border Protection supervisors were notified immediately. Soon additional federal personnel arrived. Photographs were taken. Evidence logs were created. Every package was weighed and documented. The investigation was now officially underway. Investigators reviewed the passengers' travel records. The itinerary raised questions. Several recent international trips followed a similar pattern. Short stays, unusual destinations, minimal luggage. The pattern was beginning to tell a story. The decision was made to continue surveillance rather than immediately confront the suspect. Officers wanted to observe his behavior. They wanted to know whether anyone else was involved. And most importantly, they wanted to avoid alerting a larger network. Several undercover officers quietly positioned themselves throughout the gate area. To other travelers, they looked completely ordinary. But every movement the suspect made was now being watched. The operation had entered its most delicate phase. Then investigators received confirmation of the total seizure weight. The numbers were staggering. The hidden shipment carried a street value worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. What began as a suspicious X-ray image had now become a major federal narcotics case, and the arrest was getting closer. As boarding time approached, investigators decided it was time to make contact. A uniformed airport officer calmly approached the passenger and politely requested a brief conversation. The traveler appeared surprised, but not alarmed. Not yet. The passenger was escorted to a nearby inspection office. The request was presented as routine. No handcuffs, no accusations, no confrontation. Investigators wanted answers before revealing what they had already discovered. Inside the interview room, investigators began with simple questions. Where are you traveling today? How long was your trip? Did you pack your luggage yourself? The passenger answered confidently, almost too confidently. According to the passenger, the suitcase had never left his possession. He claimed he packed everything personally. He insisted he knew nothing about hidden compartments. At first, the story sounded believable, but investigators already knew there was a problem. Minutes later, investigators placed photographs of the hidden packages on the table. The room became noticeably quieter. For the first time, the passenger's confidence appeared to crack. His expression changed, and investigators noticed immediately. The passenger quickly changed his explanation. Now he claimed the suitcase belonged to a friend, someone he had met during the trip, someone investigators had never heard of, and someone he could barely identify. Changing stories is often a warning sign during criminal investigations. Experienced agents know the details, usually become less consistent when someone is hiding the truth, and the inconsistencies were beginning to multiply. While the interview continued, digital forensic specialists began examining the passenger's electronic devices under proper legal procedures. What they found would dramatically change the direction of the case. Several messages appeared suspicious. Travel instructions, meeting locations, references to payments. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they painted a very different picture. A picture investigators could no longer ignore. By the end of the interview, investigators reached an important conclusion. This case was no longer about a single suitcase. The evidence suggested a larger trafficking organization operating beyond the airport, and that realization brought a new agency into the investigation. Homeland Security investigations. Within hours, Homeland Security investigations agents arrived at Miami International Airport. What began as a suspicious suitcase was rapidly evolving into a multi-agency federal investigation. The question was no longer whether drugs had been smuggled. The question was who was behind it. Agents began examining the suspect's finances, bank records, money transfer histories, travel expenses. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. But experienced investigators know that criminal organizations rarely leave obvious trails. Then investigators noticed a pattern. Several international transfers had been received shortly before major trips. The amounts were small enough to avoid attention, but repeated often enough to raise serious questions. The transfers appeared connected to individuals located outside the United States. Some names matched information already known to federal narcotics investigators. For the first time, agents began seeing possible links to a larger trafficking network. Meanwhile, agents continued interviewing the suspect. Each conversation revealed new contradictions. Details changed. Dates shifted. Explanations became less convincing. The story was slowly falling apart. Investigators discovered that one phone number repeatedly appeared throughout the suspect's communications. The number belonged to an individual already under investigation in another narcotics case. That connection immediately elevated the case. Agents now believed the suspect was not an organizer. He was a courier, a small but important piece of a much larger operation. And somewhere beyond the airport, other members of the network were still active. Rather than ending the investigation with a simple arrest, agents explored another option. Could the suspect provide information? Could he help identify higher-ranking members of the organization? The decision carried significant risks. As investigators reviewed the evidence, one fact became impossible to ignore. The smuggling method itself was remarkably sophisticated. The hidden compartment had been professionally constructed. Someone with experience had prepared the suitcase. By the end of the first day, investigators had reached a troubling conclusion. This was not an isolated incident. There was a strong possibility that similar shipments had already passed through airports undetected, and that realization changed everything. The next phase of the investigation focused on the suspect's previous trips. Agents reviewed airline records dating back nearly 2 years. What they found was troubling. The same travel pattern appeared again and again. Short international visits, quick returns, minimal luggage. One particular trip immediately stood out. The suspect had spent less than 48 hours abroad before returning to Miami. For a normal traveler, it made little sense. For investigators, it looked very familiar. Agents requested surveillance footage from multiple airports connected to the suspect's travel history. Hours of video were collected, then days, then weeks. The review process became a massive operation. One recording caught investigators' attention. The suspect appeared to meet an unidentified individual shortly before checking in for an international flight. The encounter lasted less than 2 minutes, but it changed the direction of the case. Investigators enhanced the footage and tracked the second individual through airport cameras. The person never boarded a flight. Instead, he exited the terminal minutes later, almost as if his only purpose was delivering something. That discovery led agents to another breakthrough. Phone records showed communication between the suspect and the unidentified individual. Shortly before several international trips, the connection was becoming impossible to dismiss. As evidence accumulated, investigators began identifying additional names. Some were couriers. Others appeared responsible for logistics. Each new connection expanded the scope of the operation. What started with one suitcase was becoming a network investigation. Federal prosecutors were briefed on the growing case. The evidence was strong, but agents needed more. To dismantle a trafficking organization, investigators needed proof connecting every level of the network. Investigators now believed the organization had successfully moved narcotics through multiple countries. The Miami seizure may have been only one shipment among many. The possibility was alarming, and it raised the stakes dramatically. Then came another major breakthrough. Financial records linked several suspects to the same payment network. Money was moving almost as efficiently as the drugs themselves. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together. With enough evidence to justify expanded surveillance, federal agents launched the next stage of the operation. The goal was no longer to understand the network. The goal was to dismantle it. And from this point forward, every phone call, meeting, and movement mattered. Agents quietly tracked several individuals linked to the investigation. Most appeared ordinary. They worked regular jobs, drove normal vehicles, blended into everyday life. But investigators believed they played critical roles within the trafficking network. Over the following weeks, agents documented dozens of meetings, restaurants, parking lots, gas stations, brief encounters that appeared meaningless to outsiders. But investigators saw patterns emerging, patterns that connected people, money, and narcotics. One meeting attracted particular attention. A suspected logistics coordinator arrived carrying a small backpack. Minutes later, another individual left with it. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet agents documented every second. The investigation was now generating enormous amounts of evidence. Photographs, video recordings, financial records, communication data, travel histories. Every piece added another layer to the growing case. Agents worked closely with federal prosecutors to prepare search warrant applications. Every statement had to be verified. Every allegation had to be supported. Because one mistake could jeopardize years of investigative work. Judges approved multiple warrants. The operation was entering its final phase. Agents now had legal authority to search properties, seize evidence, and make arrests. The countdown had begun. Investigators selected a date for coordinated enforcement actions. Several locations would be targeted simultaneously. The objective was simple: prevent anyone from destroying evidence or warning other members of the network. As the operation approached, surveillance intensified. Agents monitored suspects around the clock. No movement was ignored. No communication was dismissed. Months of investigation were about to reach their most dangerous moment. Then, just 48 hours before the planned takedown, investigators received unexpected intelligence. One suspect appeared to be preparing for another international shipment. If true, the network was still actively moving narcotics, and the operation suddenly became far more urgent. The new intelligence changed everything. Federal supervisors immediately called an emergency meeting. If another shipment was about to move, agents could not afford to wait much longer. Months of surveillance had produced valuable evidence, but another successful smuggling attempt was a risk they were unwilling to take. Agents reviewed every available report one final time: travel records, phone communications, financial transactions, surveillance footage. The evidence was overwhelming. The operation was ready. Before dawn, tactical teams quietly assembled at multiple locations across South Florida. Vehicles remained unmarked. Radios stayed silent. Everyone involved understood the importance of what was about to happen. As the city slept, operation commanders synchronized every team. Each target location received precise instructions. Every minute was scheduled. Every movement was coordinated. There would be no second chance. Just after sunrise, agents moved. Teams approached residences, vehicles, and suspected meeting locations simultaneously. The objective was speed, surprise, and total control. At one location, investigators discovered additional concealed narcotics. At another, they recovered communication devices linked to the network. The evidence continued to grow, and with every discovery, the case became stronger. Several key suspects were detained without incident. Some chose to remain silent. Others immediately requested attorneys. A few appeared shocked that investigators knew so much about the operation. Meanwhile, forensic teams worked rapidly to process newly seized evidence: hard drives, mobile phones, financial records. The investigation was still uncovering new information, even as arrests were being made. By the end of the day, federal authorities had dismantled what they believed was a significant trafficking cell operating through international travel routes. The network's ability to move narcotics had been severely disrupted. But the legal battle was only beginning. For investigators, the arrests represented the end of one chapter. For prosecutors, they marked the beginning of another, because now every piece of evidence would face scrutiny inside a federal courtroom. And the outcome was far from guaranteed. Weeks after the arrests, federal prosecutors presented the evidence to a grand jury. The investigation had produced thousands of pages of reports, financial records, travel histories, communication logs, and evidence collected directly from the seized suitcase at Miami International Airport. The grand jury reviewed the evidence carefully. Witness statements were presented. Investigative findings were explained. And after reviewing the case, formal federal charges were approved against multiple individuals connected to the trafficking operation. The charges were serious: drug trafficking conspiracy, possession with intent to distribute, importation-related offenses. Convictions on these charges could result in years, and in some cases decades, in federal prison. Defense attorneys quickly began preparing their strategy. Their argument was straightforward. The suspect claimed He had no knowledge of the drugs hidden inside the suitcase. He insisted he was merely an unwitting traveler caught in a larger scheme. Prosecutors disagreed. They pointed to changing statements, travel patterns, financial records, and communications recovered during the investigation. According to prosecutors, the evidence demonstrated knowledge, intent, and participation. When the trial began, jurors were introduced to the details of the investigation: the hidden compartment, the seized narcotics, the surveillance operation, the financial analysis. Each piece of evidence was presented step by step. Investigators testified about the discovery at Miami International Airport. They described the unusual X-ray image, the secondary inspection, and the moment concealed packages were found beneath the suitcase lining. The jury listened closely. Digital forensic specialists explained how communications had connected multiple individuals involved in the operation, phone records, travel instructions, meeting locations. Together, they helped reveal the structure of the trafficking network. As the trial progressed, prosecutors argued that the evidence formed a complete picture, not a coincidence, not bad luck, but participation in a coordinated trafficking operation designed to move narcotics through international travel routes. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the trial entered its final stage. The jury received instructions from the judge. Then deliberations began. The future of everyone involved now rested behind closed doors. Days later, the courtroom filled once again. Prosecutors returned. Defense attorneys returned. Family members waited anxiously. And after months of investigation and weeks of testimony, the jury was finally ready to announce its decision. One by one, the verdicts were read aloud. The courtroom remained silent. Jurors had carefully reviewed the evidence: the travel records, the communications, the financial transactions, and the narcotics discovered at Miami International Airport. For several defendants, the outcome was devastating. The jury found sufficient evidence to support major trafficking-related convictions. Years of planning, months of investigation, weeks of trial. Everything had led to this moment. Sentencing hearings followed. Prosecutors described the scale of the operation, the quantity of narcotics involved, and the risks such trafficking posed to communities across multiple countries. The court considered every detail. Defense attorneys asked for leniency. Some defendants expressed regret. Others maintained their innocence. The court listened carefully, but sentencing decisions would ultimately be based on evidence, law, and responsibility. When the judge delivered the final sentences, years of federal prison time were imposed on multiple participants. The trafficking operation that once appeared invisible had been exposed, investigated, prosecuted, and dismantled. Outside the courtroom, investigators reflected on the case. It had started with a single suspicious image on an airport X-ray monitor, a detail so small that many travelers would never notice it. Yet that detail changed everything. The investigation demonstrated how modern airport security relies on more than technology alone. Machines identify anomalies, but trained officers recognize patterns. Experience, instinct, and attention to detail remain some of the most powerful tools in law enforcement. For the trafficking network, the consequences extended far beyond the airport. Communication channels were disrupted, financial operations were exposed, key members were arrested, and a route that had once generated enormous profits was effectively shut down. On the surface, Miami International Airport returned to normal the very next day. Flights departed, passengers checked in, luggage moved through screening systems. But hidden behind the routine rhythm of global travel was a reminder. Sometimes the biggest criminal investigations begin with the smallest mistake. And in this case, one overlooked detail transformed an ordinary suitcase into the key piece of evidence that brought an entire trafficking operation crashing down. Every year, airport security officers inspect millions of passengers and bags. Most journeys end without incident, but occasionally one small anomaly uncovers a much larger story. Airport security versus drug cartels, the smugglers' biggest mistakes.